So, hi everybody, I hope you're all doing well. We are delighted to have so many of you join us today to kick off AnswerLab's spring webinar series to learn about recruiting processes for inclusive UX research. My name is Naomi, I'm part of the team here at AnswerLab. And before we begin, I just want to run through a couple of quick housekeeping items. Firstly, I want to let you all know that this webinar is being recorded, so everybody that's registered will receive a copy of the recording via email afterwards. If you have any questions today that you'd like to submit, please do so via the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and our speakers will cover as many as possible at the end of the presentation. We have about 45 minutes of content today, including time to get to your questions, so we'll make sure to keep to 45 minutes to keep you all on track for the rest of your day. For those of you that don't know us, AnswerLab is a full-service UX research company that provides user experience research, consulting services, and flexible research engagement models to help companies apply a human-centered design process to every product that they launch. Our mission is to help create experiences that people love, and we know that too often underrepresented groups do not have great digital experiences, and we are on a mission to change that. So now I have the pleasure of introducing our speakers for today. David Muñoz and Gina Tenenbaum are part of our inclusivity team at AnswerLab. They've been reworking how AnswerLab defines and incorporates inclusivity across all of our studies. David is a senior UX researcher based out of Pittsburgh, and he has led research efforts for the past 10 years for both in-house and external consulting teams, and he specializes in the financial and technology sectors. Gina has 16 years of research experience and has been with AnswerLab for the last 2.5 years. She's based out of Atlanta and manages one of our research operations teams, which focuses on a large tech company. So with that, I will hand it over to Gina.
Thank you so much, and hello everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Inclusivity has been a large part of our work here at AnswerLab. Today, we're going to show you how we have reevaluated our recruiting process and also how we track and measure ourselves against those and how you can apply this to your team as well. So as we're speaking to you today, please remember that in order to make these changes, this is going to be a long process that needs to be studied and iterated and is not just a checkbox. So I'll be speaking to you specifically about how inclusive research starts with an inclusive recruit and what you and your team can do to make these changes. It's really important that we make sure that we're getting the right people into these studies and that we're hearing all sorts of different voices. So you might ask, well, why is this so important, Gina? Well, I'll tell you. As Naomi mentioned, our mission is to create experiences that people love. It's very important that we make sure that all voices are getting included. The world's changing. We want to change with it. We also find that we get the best insights when we recruit as inclusively as possible. And last but not least, we want to be able to track data so that we can help our clients improve on their research practices as well. So this all starts with what AnswerLab does best, being a great partner. Before, we would take the specs that our clients gave us, listen to their background and objectives of the study, and talk about exactly who we were going to recruit. Well, now we're still doing all of that, but also layering on our inclusive research practices and explaining to them why we're asking things the way that we are and hoping to get them to agree to include those things in our screeners too. So as you can see here, these are the 5 things that we decided to not only match to the US Census in our domestic studies, but also to track on the back end, which David will get into a little later. As you can see here, the percentages are exactly what's in the US Census. So for example, with a study of a sample size of 6, we would look for at least 2 folks who are 55 years and older, at least 1 who lives in a rural location, 1 who is an African American or Black participant, 1 Latino or Hispanic participant, of course, including those others as they fall, and then at least one person who identifies as being LGBTQIA and one who has an accessibility condition. And we know that these are lower percentages and we might not hit one, but hopefully overall with all of our studies, we are able to include those folks as well. Now you might be asking too, well, how did you go about these? A couple of the questions, such as ages, ethnicities, I'll show you an example in a moment, we're already in our screener, so we didn't add anything there. And then, as explained, we thought it was important to also include those rural folks, those LGBTQIA and accessibility conditions as well. So we have changed the way that we ask gender and ethnicity to now both be open-ended. We added a question to find out where folks live, so urban, suburban, and rural. Sometimes we're also adding the quadrant of the US where they live, so north, south, west, mountain areas. We added questions to see if the respondent identifies as being LGBTQIA, and if the respondent had an impairment or special need. And last but not least, asking their employment status both prior to and during the pandemic. That way, we can maybe include someone who has been laid off or furloughed, whereas they normally would have been left out. All right, so as promised, I'm going to show you some examples of two of our questions that we updated in our screeners. So here you see on the left, this is our gender question, our old gender question. And these two examples are intended to be phone screenings. We adjust them as necessary if we're going to do an online screening. But for instance, here on the left, there's a couple things wrong with this question, as you can see. First of all, we're reliant on the recruiter to listen to the respondent's voice and then decide if they are male or female based on the voice. We also are only giving two choices, right? Male or female. Now I'll show you our new question. So now our new question is not only asking this open-ended, we're allowing a couple more choices. So there's woman, man, non-binary. They can prefer to self-identify, or there's now an opt-out choice if they prefer not to say. So you might be asking yourself, well, how'd you come up with these choices and decide that this was the way to do it? We did internal interviews with AnswerLabbers. We also interviewed those outside of AnswerLab, read many articles, watched many videos, all the research you can think of, we did it, and that's how we decided to go about doing it this way. My second example to show you is on ethnicity. So as you can see here, again, we have a limited number of choices, and there is no opt-out choice. So we revamped this question too, and are also explaining to the participant why we're asking. So not just to be nosy, but that we are trying to include everyone's voice and all sorts of variety of backgrounds. And also, as you can see, there are many choices within each of these ethnic categories for someone to identify with. And then the recruiter can just simply jot down what the respondent said and go back and categorize it later. So now I'm going to talk to you a little bit about why we are including some things that we weren't including prior. So with age, we are including, as I mentioned, 55-plus-year-olds. And there's two main reasons there. Not only has the 55-plus-year-old community grown in their population size, but many folks who fall within that age category are using technology a lot more than they used to. I don't know about you, but my in-laws had no clue what a QR code was prior to the pandemic, and now they know what it is and how to use it. And so their voice is important to include in our research for those sorts of products going forward. Also, we are asking for necessary accommodations or assistive technology that's used. And that is so that we're not only including someone who might be using an assistive technology device, such as a screen reader, but also that our UXRs are trained on how to interact with someone using a screen reader. And if they personally have not been formally trained, they can meet with another subject matter expert on our team or view many of our various resources to learn how to interact with someone so that they are prepared for their interview. So adding that can help your team do that as well. As I mentioned with location, Prior to the pandemic, we were doing most of our research in person in large cities. And because of the pandemic, have gone to recruiting nationally and holding our interviews remote. And this has allowed us to include those rural folks. We might not have been able to come to a facility in New York or Chicago, but now we can have their voice be heard as well. Now, these last two things, I know that there are various opinions on out there, but I do just want to talk about why it's important to think about not only how you're asking about these things, the choices you're giving, and trying to include as many people as you can. So with household income, it's an old industry standard, let's say, to include folks who, or not include folks who make under, let's say, 25 or 30K. Well, these people might still be users of your products and they might still be a good target respondent to speak to. So think about opening up to either not ask the income if it's not necessary, or allowing those folks who make lower income, or even have studies just around those folks who make lower income to see how you can improve on your product based on what you find after speaking to them. And then with marital status, so this is another kind of outdated thing. It doesn't tell us exactly what it used to tell us. And instead of asking marital status, we have chosen to ask the household size and then break down that household size into adults and versus the children in the home. And that tells us a lot more, we found, than actually whether the person is married, single, etc. All right. So just to recap what I have spoken to you about. So rethink your established templates. Look at your screener. Look at the way you're asking the questions, the choices you're given, whether or not you still need to ask the questions or replace them with new ways, and include everybody that you can. Secondly, you want to get a wide range of perspectives. As I mentioned, spoke to AnswerLabbers, spoke to those outside of AnswerLab, did a bunch of online research just to make sure that we were including everybody that we could, and that the way that our questions were written and choices were given were as inclusive as possible. This next one is to get rid of the idea of your perfect participant, right? So let's say someone, you're looking for somebody that's applying for a loan or is a credit card holder. Well, maybe if they have been laid off or furloughed because of the pandemic, they could still be wanting to apply for that loan and be able to pay it back too. So just be thinking of who all you could include that you might have left out prior. And instead of the perfect participant, what all you can still include and meet your objectives. This last one, if you don't listen to anything else I say today, make sure that you are including extra time into your process. This isn't just a checkbox. However long you think it's going to take you once you meet with your team, I would add about 4 to 6 weeks on top of that. And make sure that you are piloting whatever you do change. We had a group of project managers that piloted our new screener and our new way of tracking this information. And then we iterated a couple of things, learned from what we found out then, and had it with the second group of pilot PMs before rolling it out to our whole research operation team. So add a little bit of extra time to however long you think it's going to take. And last but not least here, make sure you're talking to your recruiters. We had to check in with some of our premier partners, not only before we rolled out our changes to our screeners, but since when we have implemented this to the entire team, just to make sure that their database can still support it, and that you can be including all the people that you want in your study. So with that, I will turn it over to David.
Thanks so much, Gina, for telling more about how we have redefined our screener and also gone about rethinking our recruiting process and defining inclusivity metrics. So what I'll be talking about now is how to hold yourself and your company accountable to make sure that you are tracking your success and meeting your goals. And there are, one sec here. There are 2 general steps that you want to think about. The overall goal is creating a system that will let you recruit and track participant demographic information consistently. And first, you need to identify what your tracking goals are. Secondly, you need to identify what the workflow looks like for tracking. And for each of these steps, I'll mention a few questions that you and your team should ask yourselves. For this first portion, in terms of your tracking goals, consider who at your company is going to be actually tracking any metrics, any information about inclusivity and diversity. Is it going to be UX researchers? Do you have a research operations team? Do you have project managers? Who exactly will be ultimately responsible for entering this information and collecting it? Secondly, think about who needs to know about those metrics and how often. Those questions, of course, will impact how you decide to report and also the cadence at which you're reporting. And on a similar note, think about who needs to act based on these metrics. So what does your feedback loop look like? If stakeholders react a certain way to your initial performance, who will have to change things, and how will they know that they need to act? The second step is in terms of the more granular tracking workflow. And this is all about how you're tracking what goes into any spreadsheet or any repository with participants' demographic information. One thing to consider is, are all of your studies going to use the same metrics? Like Gina was describing earlier, we at AnswerLab picked a select few criteria that we are tracking closely, such as race, ethnicity, age, and so forth. And for us, we use the same metrics regardless of the study, regardless of the client. But for your company, maybe you have two products and they're geared towards totally separate audiences. So maybe depending on which product you're doing research for, there might be different metrics. And there might be some that stay the same. Secondly, how are you tracking the participant data? Are you using a spreadsheet? What kind of tool will be used to collect and store the information? Also think about how you're going to train your team. Like Gina mentioned, on our inclusivity journey at AnswerLab, as we redefined our screener and recruiting process, it definitely took more time than we initially expected, to be honest. There were lots of details we had to hammer out. And one of those was the training. We needed to make sure we had consistent and clear presentation material so that for us, project managers and researchers understood what did not need to be included in our data repository with all of the participant demographic information. And last but not least, what software are you using to track? And do you already have access to the tool, or is it something that you may need additional budget for? So now that I've talked about those two high-level steps, let me share a few examples and things that we learned at AnswerLab as we built our own tracking system. And in terms of the tracking spreadsheet and the process that we followed, here are a few things I'd love to share in terms of what we learned. One thing we saw early on was it was really important to have a central point person for questions in case anyone was unclear on our process or anything else. And so clearly establishing Gina as that point person really made a difference. Also, in terms of collaboration tools, I know I mentioned that on some of the previous slides. We really do recommend, if possible, using a web-based tool, just especially now with many of us working remotely for the foreseeable future, or having coworkers who are working remotely. It's really important to have everyone who needs access have that access at any time, any location. And analysis and reporting is something else to consider. It should hopefully be easy to build analyses and dashboards as needed with this tool. That's part of the reason why for us, the choice we decided to make was using Google Drive and Google Sheets specifically to create a spreadsheet, create analyses, and they have some nice built-in widgets and graphs as well. And something else that's very important to clarify is any study exclusion criteria. So for us, we are tracking participants who we actually spoke with. For our studies, which are typically an N of 6 or multiples of 6, we'll have 1 or 2 backups per 6 participants, floater participant, alternate participants. And for our purposes, again, we only track the information, the demographic information for those participants we actually spoke with. So just clarifying that made a big difference as well, because sometimes there might be times where we may need to speak to 7 participants. So again, that's not a multiple of 6. But it's important to mention that for most cases, that should not be the case for us. For your company, maybe again, there are certain products where there are certain studies that you have decided not to track metrics for multiple reasons. Equally as important as building the process for the spreadsheet is building the spreadsheet itself. Like I mentioned, consistency is key here, especially as you do more and more studies over time. One thing to consider is the column order. You may notice here on the slide, we have a few cells that say A2.age, A3.location type. What the A2 and A3 are referring to is the actual question order that these are asked in when our recruiters call participants and schedule them. So our project managers, who are the ones primarily entering in information to our central data repository, they're quickly able to see, okay, from this grid that the recruiting firm has sent us, this is the exact order that these columns need to be entered into. Filtering, also very important. It should be easy for your team to slice and dice the data as needed. So if possible, try and build that in as well. Data validation, that was also key. Like Gina mentioned, we, as a research company, of course, piloted our own system to see what worked, what didn't. One thing we noticed was typos, of course, could potentially throw an analysis off, right? If sometimes suburban is spelled with an extra B, let's say, right? So to control for that as much as possible, you may notice that on this slide for the cells, we have arrows that when clicked on show a drop-down menu of the possible choices for that column. And those have all been predefined. There is very little, if any, room for error there. And of course, it makes the job of entering information that much easier and quicker. And last but not least, accountability. We have a column here for the project manager name, just so we know who entered in the information for a specific study. Like I was referring to earlier, sometimes we do end up having a sample size that's not a multiple of 6. And so for our analysis team, it's important to be able to follow up and say, hey, was this study actually one that had 7 participants or 13 participants, or maybe was there a participant who shouldn't have been entered in, maybe one of those backup participants that we didn't speak with. In terms of reporting framework, here's one example of the summary that you might create. You might notice at the top, we have statistics for an entire calendar year for 2020. We also have examples for H1, the first half of the year, and H2, the second half. And that's something you should consider for your company as well, in terms of how you're reporting. What is the frequency that your stakeholders are most interested in? Maybe it's more granular, maybe it's at the monthly or quarterly level. Maybe this higher level view is what is most valuable to them. Also, think about how you're going to share this information out, depending on who your stakeholders are, their background with these metrics, their involvement. You may want to meet with them in case they have any questions or comments. An email might be sufficient. Maybe it's a combination, maybe it's something else. Really think about your company, how you communicate, and take it from there. Interactivity, that's another closely related thing to consider. Depending on who the stakeholders are, it may be beneficial to make some of these tables, any graphs you have, more interactive. But for other stakeholders, maybe it's not as useful to have that interactivity. And also think about how you're actually going to be acting on what you learned from these summaries. So you'll notice here in this example, we have color coding to easily indicate the metrics that where we overachieved and those where maybe we didn't quite meet our standards. So think about how you'll know which metrics you may need to act on and how you'll communicate that to anyone who needs to adjust. So to summarize, I'd like to cover the lessons we've learned along the way in terms of the process of tracking this information. Again, can't stress this enough. Easy and consistent, those are super important things to keep in mind, especially let's say you have 10 researchers, they're all doing their own recruiting, they're doing multiple studies a month. It really should be as painless and as quick as possible for them to do to track participants' demographic information. And also make sure that any training materials, any communication is crystal clear in terms of the process, of course, but also if you have any exclusions, let's say again, your company has 4 products and all studies have inclusivity related metrics except for product D, let's say. That again should be very clear. Piloting and iterating, again, we always love as a research-based company to try out any new process we want to incorporate ourselves first to see what we learned along the way. We also encourage you and your team and company to do the same thing. Try this system out and adjust based on what you observe. And of course, communicating the value, that's really important to make sure you're doing with your stakeholders. Make sure that they understand why you are or aren't tracking. Again, inclusivity is a journey, right? There's a start point, but there's really no end point. There's always evolution. So maybe you adjust metrics over time. Maybe you start off with 2, might bump up to 5, might go back down to 4. So whatever you end up doing, whatever best meets you and your company's needs, make sure that you are showing the value of these metrics and how you are or aren't accomplishing certain ones. So with all that said, keep in mind every design decision has the potential to, unintentionally or not, exclude or include people. What we have shared with you today is how we have rethought our recruiting process to focus more on diversity, on inclusivity, but having more consistent voices from those in marginalized populations will not in itself give you an in-detailed view of specific populations' views on the world, on your product, on your brand. So we also recommend experience gap research. And this is completely focused on understanding perspectives and attitudes from specific underrepresented populations. So with this kind of research, this is how you can really identify if you have any gaps, hence the name, in your product, in your experience, in your workflow. You might learn more about design elements that, again, unintentional or not, are harming or dissuading specific populations from using your product or from being able to use it as efficiently as they could. And so I'll end on a bit of a cliffhanger. We will be exploring this topic in the future in an upcoming webinar. So hopefully if you're interested in what I've just mentioned, you'll be able to join us for that. And with that, I'll hand it back to Naomi.
Thank you, David. So let's take a look at some of those questions. Gina, this looks like one for you. In terms of writing screeners to pull in groups that have largely been neglected or ignored, do you have any tips in terms of language that should definitely be used or definitely be avoided?
Great question. Thanks for asking it. We want to avoid saying minority when possible, also disability. So instead of saying disability, you might want to say condition or impairment. Another thing that we changed here at AnswerLab was we used to call our NDA when we weren't revealing who the client was, a blind NDA. And now we have changed that to be an anonymous NDA. So really take a look at not only the words you're using in your questions, but also what you're calling your documents you might be sending respondents to.
Thanks, Gina. David, I'm going to ask you this next one. We have tight timelines for doing research. How do we account for those while doing studies that include generative and evaluative research and incorporate inclusivity and accessibility?
Also, great question. Never enough time, as we all know in research, right? There's always studies we want to do, always follow-ups we want to explore. So in general, what we recommend is having separate streams that always have some kind of research happening. Depending on your company, the cadence might be slightly different, but we do recommend having separate streams for accessibility, usability research, inclusivity research, and specifically for usability research, for the approach that we've discussed today, where we're trying to include diversity across our studies. What we recommend, especially if your team's using any research platforms like UserZoom, user testing, and so forth, where you may not have as fine control over your recruits as when a live recruiter is calling potential participants. In those cases, we suggest having 2 studies. So let's imagine that for usability tests, you're looking for N of 6, right? So you could do 2 N of 3 studies. And in one of those, you will recruit anyone who meets the general study criteria. And the second study, the N of 3, that's where you can specify, okay, we only, depending again on your company's needs, we're only looking for adults over 55 years old. We're only looking for Hispanic or Latinx participants. And you can rotate this by month. So that way, over time, you will get more diverse participants across your studies.
Great, thanks, David. This next question is asking what ethnic group to include for more inclusive research.
I can take that one. So, you know, you can take a look at your product and your target users and your inclusivity goals and decide this on your own. You don't have to include the ethnicities that we've included or even the percentages that we've included. You'll just want to take a look at, like I said, who you've recruited in the past and who your target user has been in the past, and see if there's any gaps there, and see who you left out. And maybe you want to target to include someone who you previously have left out of your studies. And really the same is true not only just with recruiting different ethnicities, but different age groups, different types of all sorts of people. You know, maybe if your product is geared towards you know, teenagers, or you're maybe not going to want to include those 55+ year olds. Or on the flip side, if your product is geared towards those who are retired, you're not going to be able to include those who are younger.
Thank you, Gina. This next question asks, when dealing with small sample sizes, how can we better screen participants to make sure that we have good representation in our participant group to get a representative makeup of our actual users?
I can take that. Also a good question. So yeah, with small sample sizes, again, it can be trickier, again, depending on if you are using a live recruiter or if you're using a research platform. So if you do have a live recruiter, again, we do recommend having multiples of 6 for your sample sizes. That way you can hopefully include more diverse voices. So again, for us at AnswerLab, we have age, especially adults 55 years or older. We also are interested in incorporating and hearing more often from Black or African American participants, as well as Latinx, and then also more diversity in terms of location. So with N of 6, usually we try and get 1 or 2 from each of those specific inclusivity related metrics. And we do try and evaluate that on a monthly and quarterly basis. This is a new process, a relatively new process for us too, right? So we may end up making changes down the road once we continue learning on how we're performing against these metrics. So again, it's an evolution. Always make sure you're reevaluating your metrics, how you're performing against them, and why you do have a select set of metrics. Maybe you need to expand or minimize. And then again, for online recruiting platforms, it can be a little trickier, especially with timing. I know in the past, I've been in situations where I literally need to get participants for an unmoderated study the same day, and then create a report over the next, like 1 or 2 days, just because the deadlines are that tight. New features, new products need to ship. So again, totally understood. We do have a follow-up article coming. Again, sorry to end on a bit of a cliffhanger here, but there will be a much more detailed article that we'll be publishing that does cover more our perspective, our point of view on these platforms, how to combine really the strengths of more traditional recruiting where individuals are called, and combining the strengths of research platforms so that you can do research more quickly, more efficiently, and of course, in a way that does incorporate diversity more often.
Great. Next question here. Do you have any helpful pointers in communicating the values of tracking inclusivity metrics?
I have one thought, and then we'll be interested to hear if Gina has any other feedback as well. So honestly, one tip we've seen is just tracking and sharing is so powerful in itself, right? Like I know today we have covered a lot of ground. It's somewhat theoretical, right? It's about our process. It's not an experience you have had yet, but believe me, if you start tracking, even if there are stakeholders who may not be, let's say, convinced, or who maybe just aren't exactly sure what inclusivity metrics are, why diversity matters, track it, and you will be so surprised after a few months if you share those metrics, what you'll learn, what your stakeholders will learn and react. We had one of our researchers who was interested for one of our clients just to show, and this was before our new approach. She was tracking the diversity of her participants, and I believe around 70% were white or Caucasian, right? And again, this was before our effort to be more diverse. She was surprised, as you might imagine. Her stakeholders were surprised. Their product is certainly not catered towards only Caucasian or white participants. So to summarize, my greatest tip is just start tracking, start sharing, start evangelizing, and let the numbers speak for themselves.
Great, thank you, David. We got a lot of questions about how to think about inclusive recruiting internationally. Can you say a bit more on how you approach inclusivity in non-US audiences?
Yeah, I can take this one. So the examples I shared on the percentages matching to the US Census are obviously just for domestic studies. When we're working in those international markets, some of these can still apply, right? But the ethnicity might be skewed a certain way. So you really have to rely on your partners there that actually are living in those countries, and ask them about their culture, ask them, really rely on them about the way your question's written, about the choices you're given. And that goes for all demographics and all things that you're asking them. They know best. They're there living in the culture.
Yep. And just a quick follow-up to that too. Again, keep in mind, depending on your company's products, maybe some are exclusively or more often used by international populations. Maybe some other products are used more by participants based in the US, right? So again, always make sure you're thinking about what metrics you're including and whether certain studies you do maybe should rely on a different set of metrics. So something to always keep in mind.
I can add one more thing to that too. Just because something isn't normal in the country yet, or accepted, don't be afraid to push the envelope a little bit. If this is an important thing for your organization, again, rely on your local vendors there, but don't be afraid to just try and see what happens. You can always drop the quota if needed.
Great. This next question, do you have any suggested strategies in reaching participants who lack access to technology?
I can take this one. You know, our work is all around apps and websites, and how respondents out there kind of go about finding that and using those products is very, very different. We have certain vendors who we have tagged as having low income and low tech folks in their database. So when we do need those folks, it's pretty simple to go and grab them. And, you know, sometimes with those folks, they might not be able to be pre-screened online. And obviously with the pandemic going on, it's very hard to reach those folks not online, but because of the pandemic, a lot of people have been increasing their use of technology. But when we can go there on foot, in person, grassroots way, old school way, we do have to do that sometimes to reach those people.
Thank you, Gina. I think we've got time for one or two more. Do you use a range of ages instead of using a single number when you're recruiting?
Yeah, I can take that one too. So yeah, we do, right? Sometimes people don't want to share the exact age. Sometimes they're willing to tell you. So we do allow it to be captured whatever way the participant is most comfortable. But as David was showing you on our actual Google sheet where we're tracking it, we are just capturing the age range. So if they do just want to answer the age range, that's all we need to be able to kind of keep an eye on things. And if they do tell us the exact age, we go ahead and record that as well.
Great. And I think we can squeeze in one more. How do you make the case to clients to broaden the idea of the perfect participant?
Yeah, good question as well. And a few things come to mind. So like earlier, to use Gina's wording too, with more kind of grassroots, right? Like start small, right? So maybe there are ways that you can start tracking on your own and start kind of building a case that way. I just had a second thought. I'll think about it for a sec. I don't know, Gina, if you have any other thoughts or suggestions.
Yeah, you know, most of our clients, I know some of you are on this webinar too, have been really great partners in the fact that you're open-minded and willing to try all the new things that we're trying. So I don't think, you know, it hasn't really been hard to persuade anybody to include these things, but we do explain why we're doing it. We explain, you know, here's our questions. Let us know, do you want to include all of them? Maybe we just want to include some of them. Maybe if they want to change the way that the question is, whatever we can do to accommodate our clients as well. And, you know, sometimes when we're doing like B2B or you know, high level KOLs or KOFs, we make these questions optional and then just note in our grid where we track whether we've captured the information or not. So we're even tracking information when we're not getting all the metrics that we're looking to get.
Yep, and thanks, Gina. That jogged my memory. So the other thought I had was around analytics, right? It is generally pretty hard to argue with numbers, right? Especially with certain stakeholders in management. So take a look at what you know about your users, right? If you have live analytics for your product, if you have any survey-based data, again, larger scale quant information, right? Do you know what % of your users are men or women, what races, what ages, what locations? And then again, kind of track on your own and see if you are or aren't generally getting that kind of diversity, right? Again, you might be pleasantly surprised or disappointed to see, oh, wow, our data, our analytics are showing that half of our participants are not white or Caucasian, but from our recent studies this year, research studies, 80% are actually Caucasian or white. Or it could be the same example for age, right? To Gina's example earlier, maybe your product is geared more towards adults getting closer to retirement. But if you look at your recent research studies, it's really more 30 to 40-year-olds. So again, they may still provide valid and useful feedback, but you aren't hitting the mark in terms of your actual users. And I think that's really one of the key points to drive home with stakeholders.
Great. Well, thank you, David and Gina. We are at time, so we're going to wrap up the questions for today. I'd like to thank you all for joining us, and we hope that you found today's discussion helpful. Before you go, I just want to take this opportunity to let you know about our next webinar in our spring series. So on April 6th, we will be doing a live demo on how to test voice assistants remotely, and we'll be sharing some strategies for success there. And then this event is also on a Tuesday at 10 a.m. Pacific, 1 p.m. Eastern, and we would love if you can join us. So with that, I'd like to thank you again for joining us, and you'll all receive a copy of the webinar recording shortly. And I hope you all have a great rest of your day.